All right. So thank you for joining me tonight. My name is Ken Rosenthal. I'm a park naturalist at Gulf Branch Nature Center, and we're going to look at some animal legends. And I can't wait, so I'm just going to get started right away. This is one of my favorite things to talk about, and I hope you find it interesting. And it's a pretty personal subject for me because I've really enjoyed looking at a lot of these kinds of things over the years, and my view of it has changed tremendously from when I started as a little kid versus the way I see things now. And I hope I can share a little bit about that and why, and hopefully inspire you to look at these stories in different ways as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Excuse me. Mode. I want to include computer sound. That's very important. And then, yeah, just my screen. All right. So hopefully you're all seeing my very unimaginative background there. And we're going to go ahead and start this. All right. So I started with a classic, and really it's a classic only in the sense that it's a this is a nice way to sell postcards and T-shirts. I don't think anybody actually believes that there are jackalopes out there, but it's a really fun one, and I've seen some different versions of this come throughout the years, and one really cute and enjoyable Pixar. Disney animated short, which is really fun, and I recommend it if you ever see it because it's a nice little uplifting story. But what I am going to do is I'm going to spend some time talking about. Oh, let me get my cursor there. There we go. Talking about legends today. So last month I talked about myths, and I more focused on myths about real animals. And what I wanted to talk about today is legends. So a lot of these are critters that simply don't exist. And I want to talk about any basis in fact or who the legendary critter, what real critter the legendary critter may have been based off of. So yes, we're gonna look at some incredibly amazing creatures and wonder sometimes what people were thinking, what they were okay believing some of these. And I'm gonna start with the same quote that I did last year, or did last month, and I'm just gonna focus on that last sentence, which is extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And a lot of times that is the whole in these stories, as far as the scientific basis, as far as reality, as far as really believing what we're seeing, is that there's just not a lot of actual evidence to follow up these stories or evidence that can be reliably linked to what people are claiming to have seen. Um, and I want to throw this term out. We'll come back to this. But cryptozoology is the science of hidden animals, and this term was coined by a zoologist named Bernard Heuvelmans. I hope I said that right. I believe I think he's Danish, maybe Dutch. He's from Europe, and he wrote a couple of books I'll mention a little bit later. I want to come back to this. We're going to start with some really old legends and just take a look at where these legends actually fall. This is um, I'm going to talk about this is my personal experience. I couldn't read enough of this stuff. This was, I think, my first book. I don't have it anymore. I had to find a photograph of the cover on Amazon.com. But it was Bigfoot and Nessie, and it was this eye-opening world of creatures that were out there that I just never heard of. I heard a little bit of, but couldn't possibly believe. Yet all these people had seen it. So how could it possibly not be true? Incidentally, I think I had another book by the first author there, Angelo Resiniti, which was a book about shark attacks, and maybe that should have opened my eyes a little bit to the kind of books that were being read. And I'm pretty sure I got this at the book fair at school too, and I think Scholastic probably did really well with that book. Um, and one quick story, because this is going to come back to some of the things I talk about as well. I used to walk a lot with my dog when I was in high school. And I just take a walk, just go through the woods and just ramble on. I ignored no trespassing signs, didn't know where I was going to end up. Just this big patch of in my head, wilderness. I know it's just this big forested patch between all the roads in my little rural area where I grew up. And I remember once hearing something crashing through the woods behind me, and I turned around, and in my head what I saw was a faun. And by faun I mean Faun, a half person half goat that you would hear from in that you would hear of it in mythology. I can't remember if it's Greek or Roman. I think it's Greek mythology. um and as I'm watching it run through the woods, and all I can focus on is its legs, it's just, and they're obviously not human legs, and I could feel this chill come across me and just panic. But at the same time, my dog had taken off after it. So I was trying to get my dog to come back. And I'm yelling at it, and I'm feeling scared because I don't want anything to happen to the dog. And it took me probably 10 seconds for my eyes to catch up because I'd focused on the legs, the back legs. And when I finally focused on the entire thing, the front legs were the same as the back legs. It was a white-tailed deer. That's all it was. It'd just been running, but it just in that moment, it had I had only caught onto the back end, and I was sure I was watching something that was half, half goat or half hoofed animal and a half human running through the woods. And I always think about that when I hear about sightings of these different things or what people saw because and I knew what a deer was obviously, but you can't tell somebody what they saw. You can hint that maybe they didn't see what they think they saw, but someone's experience uh, um you can't really just tell them what they saw, either politely, just as a, well, that's not what you saw, because that's not always going to go well and it's not going to help the conversation, but also you weren't there, and that's what their memory comes, and the further on you go, the further away you come from an incident, the more that memory can be shaped or altered by your brain is this amazing pattern recognizing instrument, and it really helps with that. And sometimes, there are things stuck in there that help you formulate these decisions of what you've seen, and it's going to make this leap that's not entirely this cognitive leap of what you're seeing that may not be the leap it should take the first time. So hopefully, you followed that. That makes a little sense. And I'll talk as we get more about some of these fantastic creatures and what people may have seen, and where these stories may have come from. We're going to start with some old stuff. One of I think the ones that is most popular and still around a lot is unicorns. I know my daughter is really into My Little Pony, and she's explained to me the difference between all the different ponies, and some of them have horns and some of them have wings. Some of them have wings and horns and all their different magics. Um, but unicorns were very much considered a real creature, um, centuries ago, and longer. And what's interesting is, I was reading that somebody, I can't remember if it was Pliny the Elder or if it was someone else who was a famous author, had written a book about Greek mythology, and unicorns weren't in Greek mythology because they were considered real. So you'd find them in the bestiary, or a description of actual real creatures, but you wouldn't find them in the mythology because they were real. So why are we going to make up stories about them? And I always thought that was a fantastic distinction between that. But you can see we got a couple of different depictions here of unicorns, and there are absolutely tons of them there. Certainly something that's still in our pop culture, and really popular today. What I thought was interesting is, the means of catching a unicorn, which was fantastic. I don't want to go ahead and read this, but it said the unicorn, through its intemperance and not knowing how to control itself, for the love it bears to fair maidens, forgets its ferocity and wildness, and laying aside all fear, it will go up to a seated damsel and go to sleep in her lap, and thus the hunters take it. And that was written by Leonardo da Vinci in one of his notebooks. It's a fantastic idea, um, and I believe there are several accounts where they also consider how virginal the maiden or damsel is, in the attraction of the unicorn to that. Unicorns are often still considered a symbol of purity, and certainly a symbol of rarity. This wasn't a common animal, which is pretty obvious because if they didn't exist, not a lot of people were seeing them, that you were assuming they were real, so they couldn't have been very common. But to this day, people still talk about unicorns as a rarity. I'm not going to cover it here, but if you want to um, have some fun, go ahead and check out the Urban Dictionary and see what its definition of the word unicorn is, and that'll be a nice little, yeah, it'd be a funny little thing to check out. Considering some of the things that are on Urban Dictionary, it's not a bad one, but they are, again, firmly in our pop culture. It's something that, you talk about a unicorn and everybody knows what that's about. Here's a couple of possible basis. I don't know how to say the plural basis. Here's a couple of animals that might be the basis for the unicorn myth. On the right is an Arabian oryx. And you can see in profile, is at the right angle. It can look like it has one horn. What's even more interesting is their horns won't regenerate. So if one of those horns gets knocked off, their hollow bone, they won't regrow. And so then you have a critter with simply one. But it doesn't really go forward off the head like the fossil animal on the right, which is Elasmotherium, and that's a genus. This one is Elasmotherium sibiricum, and I just like that they called it the Siberian unicorn. But you can see that is certainly much closer to, as far as the placement of the horn, what we're talking about with the unicorn stories, where the horn is. These horns were supposed to be full of magical power. They're supposed to be full of healing ability. They could prevent poisons, you from being poisoned, which apparently was a really big concern back then. And so people would sell these horns. And this is one of those unicorn horns. It's called an alicorn, ALICORN, which is funny because, as again, like I said, my daughter's into My Little Pony, and alicorns apparently in My Little Pony are Pegasus with a unicorn horn that have magical powers. But this is an alicorn, this horn here, and these are sold pretty regularly. People would buy these expecting to get medicinal healing power properties from them, expecting them to be able to prevent the person who bought them and ground it up from being poisoned. And so this is a pretty big deal, and they're probably expensive for the time. So where did they come from? Well, they actually came from kind of a unicorn. They came from narwhals. The narwhals were caught, and the horns were plucked off of them and then sold as unicorn horns. So again, at some point, someone back there had to be like, well, either we can't find a real unicorn, so we'll make them up, or we know unicorns aren't real, but we're still going to sell you a unicorn horn to make some money off it and keep the stories going, so we can make some money and be profitable. And again, um, there's no evidence that any of those properties are in the unicorn horns. What's interesting, if you were with me last month, we talked about this gentleman who, and again, I think it's probably pronounced Ole Verm, who was in some ways a more modern thinker when it came to um, uh, natural history and things like that. And so he had a role in dispelling a bit of the myth about lemmings. But today we're going to talk about how the fact that he had acknowledged that unicorns didn't exist. So these horns that they were selling were not unicorn horns, um, that they were from narwhals. And so he was really important in getting that idea out. But then he turned around and still thought that maybe that they were still have those properties. And see, he actually poisoned several of his pets and then gave them narwhal horns to try to see if it would work, if the poisoning would be prevented by the unicorn horns. And he probably didn't poison them very much because excuse me, the pets all recovered. So he couldn't have given them a very serious poisoning, because again, there's no properties in that narwhal horn. But I think he concluded that yeah, the narwhal horn still works, which is kind of interesting. Another of these more older myths or legends that we think of is mermaids, half human, half fish. And again, mermaids is the more, I have my little snarky comment there, but mermaids are the more common of the sightings, or the more discussed. There are mermen, and I have a feeling that if you're a sailor who's been on a ship for a long time, and it's probably not an easy life, and it's probably a lot of hardships, and if at some point you're starting to see things, it'd be really easy to spot a half person, half fish with some um, actual real marine creature. And again, if you're on a ship that's only with men, it's probably more easy to imagine that that creature you spotted that's half human is also half female. The picture on the right, or on the left, is called a Ningyo. I'm not even sure I'm saying that right. Ningyo, and this is a mermaid type creature from Japan. And this is purportedly to have been pulled out of Toyama Bay. I don't remember what the body of water was called then, but it's modern day Toyama Bay. And it was just the head. It was a fish with just the head of a human. Um, and it was a ridiculous amount of rifles apparently that had to shoot it in order to kill it. And I forget, it was certainly large. And I've always wondered if that was just a fish with some odd growth. If you remember my talk from last month, I showed a picture when we were talking about sharks don't get cancer and how that's not true. I showed a picture of a shark with a pretty significant growth on its lower jaw, and it's easy to see how some fleshy growth like that on the head of a shark, or even another fish, could give it the look of a human head at the front there. Or it could just be completely made up to sound like a great story as well. You know, that's always a possibility as well, and we'll come back to that too. But again, mermaids, mermen, certainly something in popular culture, certainly something you see in several different movies. Obviously, the two on the left are much happier. You get the Little Mermaid, and Daryl Hannah was a mermaid in a movie called Splash back in the '80s, also from Walt Disney. In the upper right, you've got one of the mermen from the fourth Harry Potter movie, the creature from the Black Lagoon in the bottom right, and a merman from the Cabin in the Woods in the middle there. So varying degrees of, very nice on the left side and not so helpful or downright hostile on the right. Um, and it really just, depends on the kind of story you're talking about here. But where did these ideas come from? And again, um, I think there's something to be said for being on a ship so long, and starting to see things, just looking at the same thing all the time. But also, a lot of these early sailors, when you're out there on that ocean and you're the first people out there, or even maybe the 20th ship that's come through there, and not everybody's aware of what's going on, and you're all going to see something different. There are some really amazing critters in the ocean that we're aware of now that they weren't aware of then. And so having our knowledge of what's in that ocean now versus what they knew back then, it could be a very big indicator for how they made these decisions about what they thought they were seeing. Um, and there's been absolute, downright hoaxes. This is the Fiji mermaid, and it was on display, I believe, first in London in like 1822. And whether P.T. Barnum had another one made or whether he actually got that one, it went on display in 1842 in one of his museums. Um, he had a lot of really interesting stuff, and uh, quite a bit of it was lost to fire in several of his different. Um, museums that he have. I believe he had more than one, and a couple of them caught fire, and so many things were lost, which is unfortunate. Which I sometimes wonder. I know things were more prone to fire back then, but I sometimes wonder um, if somebody lit one on fire. He had one sign up in one of these called "This Way to the Egress," and you'd walk through the door and find yourself in the alley outside of the museum because you went out an exit, which is what the word egress means. And when they came back in to get back in, he'd recharge them to enter the museum again. So he was not always the most trustworthy person with some of these things. And to this, there have been several more mermaids that have been documented since then that have been constructed by people. Again, none of these are by any means real, and frankly, they're quite downright disturbing. I mean, somebody took the time to put all these pieces together and then try to trick people. It's very, very interesting. Um, for exploration into the Caribbean, where there are manatee, certainly the closer to land where you might see these critters, it's thought that manatees could have inspired some of the legends. I think it's hard to look at a picture of a manatee and try to figure out how somebody would see a person in that, unless you consider again. I just come back to being on that boat for so long and starting to see things in general. But also manatees um, have all these different poses. This is a sketch of manatee, several different poses you'd see manatees doing in captivity. And when you see the array of movement here and the shapes and the different angles that they can lay, I could see how somebody might be confused about what they're seeing. Um, so that's mermaids. So we're going to move ahead a little bit here. I want to take a second and go over three quick thoughts before we jump into some more modern um, critters. I think I got one more in the 1700s, but then we're going to jump ahead a little bit. Um, but I do want to, I have three things I want you to consider. First, the role of yellow journalism. When you look at 17, I can't remember the exact, um, I can't remember the exact years. I'm blanking right now. But if you consider the distrust of the media today, um, and I'd like to think that there's a lot of the media that's trying to get it right, or they're at least using the correct information if they're using it in a skewed way to make their point. If you go back to uh, the last turn of the century, like late 1800s, 1900s, some people were writing anything to sell papers, and papers was big business, and so they were even less uh, worried about putting it in something that was factual. And that the role of yellow journalism, or the name yellow journalism, comes from this cartoon character. It's thought to have a basis in this cartoon character. This was a yellow kid. His name was, I think, Mickey Dugan. And he wore this yellow shirt, and it had a lot of uh, political statements and satire that came through this comic strip. But it was um, a popular strip, and then the guy got lured away to another paper, and it was these two competing papers, and that's where a lot of these stories come from. Is this competition, especially in the bigger cities, to have the better paper and the one to buy. It was interesting as it wasn't properly copyrighted, so it ended up appearing in both papers for like 3 or 4 years as well. But the role of yellow journalism, and again, literally things were just made up and written as a newspaper article. Here's a really good example: the disappearance of David Lang. Again, I read tons of unsolved mysteries, and I remember reading this one as a kid and really being chilled by it. And the story is that this gentleman, David Lang, was walking through his field. He was in full view of, I think, 7 different people, a couple family members. There was the judge in a carriage, and if it's a judge, that's obviously somebody that carries a lot of weight and can't possibly be fooled, and obviously has impeccable observational skills. Oh, that was sarcasm. Um, he's this gentleman, David Lang, is walking through his field. He turns to wave somebody and then disappears in front of 7 different people, just gone. And you can find this repeated, and you can find this. I can still find this on websites, and especially like at Halloween. They're like, and this was amazing, and it happened, and you can look for it. It's documented here. It was um, researchers who have looked in this have directly traced it back to a short story by Ambrose Bierce. And it's almost, except for the, like, I think the name change, it's the details are pretty much 100% in there. And this is a fictional short story. It was a little science fiction story. He wrote another one about a kid who left a Christmas party and went out in the backyard to go um, either to the outhouse or to the woodshed. And then they heard screams from the backyard, and they ran out and they couldn't find him because his footsteps stopped in the middle of the field. And they heard a voice above go, "Oh no," or something like, "I'm being taken away." And that was the last they ever saw of poor, I think it was Oliver Lurch. And if you change that to another name, it's another Ambrose Bierce story. And that was put into newspapers as a story as well. And so this role of yellow journalism, sometimes they made creatures up, they made airships up. There's a lot of um, UFO researchers that'll point to airships being seen at this time, at a time when the journalism was extremely unreliable, especially for these fantastic claims. So I want you to keep that in mind. I want you to keep in mind Occam's razor. We're going to go in the other direction here, and um, ultimately it comes down to the fewer assumptions an explanation of a phenomenon depends on, the better the explanation. That doesn't mean you can just be like, well, they made it up, because that's one assumption. But it is about critical thinking, and how many assumptions do you have to make for this to be true? And it's very similar to extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And so Occam's razor is a really important um, piece of baloney detection. If I can quote Carl Sagan again, he always often talked about having a baloney detection kit, and one of his things was, how many assumptions do you have to make for this to be true? Do you have to make a lot of assumptions or a few? Because the fewer assumptions you make, the more reliable your explanation is. And I'm going to come back to that definition of cryptozoology, because when I looked it up in Wikipedia, I really appreciated how they wrote it. And their first line is: cryptozoology is a pseudoscience and subculture that aims to prove the existence of entities from the folklore record, such as Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, Yeti, the Chupacabra, the Jersey Devil, or the Mokele Mbembe. When you talk about science, science is about gathering data. And so, and you can have a theory, you can have a hypothesis, I think is a better way to put it. You can have a hypothesis, but when you gather the data, that data should lead you to either reject or confirm that hypothesis. But when you specifically aim, as in this line here says, when you specifically aim to prove the existence of a creature, you're not doing science. You're just going out and trying to find stuff that agrees with you. And that's a very different process. And so one of the things when I was younger and I didn't have, I would feel as honed some critical thinking skills. I just read this stuff and be like, "This is fantastic. How do we not hear more about this? Oh, this stuff is amazing." Now as an adult, I'm like, "Oh, okay, I get it. I see why some of these stories were organized by what I consider at the time to be more reputable sources, and I can get why that's there. And it's amazing how many of the stories that I read as a kid have been explained with various things, like the Bermuda Triangle. Just somebody just whole cloth made that up. And there's, for a lot of those disappearances that are attributed to it, there were a lot of really simple and in many ways saddening reasons behind why some of these disappearances happened. It had nothing to do with this sinister area of the ocean, and they briefly tried that with a patch of ocean in the off the coast of Japan, I believe, that didn't last much longer under any scrutiny as well. And so, having understanding where some of these base stories might come from, like again, yellow journalism at the turn of the last century, applying Occam's razor and understanding, that sometimes the people that are behind this quote unquote research in cryptozoology are really trying to prove something instead of just looking at something where the really rational or skeptical eye can be all the difference in how we view those things. So let's look at some more contemporary examples. Before I forget, um, this is one of the things I always used to hang my hat on when I would talk about stuff. It's like, well, you can't discount that we might find this stuff. I mean, we just found the okapi in 1901, or the mountain gorilla in 1902, which is really just a subspecies. Or as recently as 1993, they described I don't even know how to pronounce that, Saula, the Vukwang. It was originally called, I remember in the first news articles I read about the Vukwang ox, or the Vukwang bovid is now it's referred to. But this is a hoofed mammal, probably the largest terrestrial mammal discovered in nearly a century. And this was in a newly christened conservation area in Vietnam. And it was a pretty big deal when they discovered this. In '93, I think they had a specimen that they had found, but it was until '99 that somebody actually got a picture. I don't know if this is the original picture, but this is a picture of what that or Vukwang bovid looks like. And then, of course, there is the crown jewel in the discussion when you talk to somebody who's all for these organisms happening, and that is the coelacanth, which was thought to have went extinct 66 million years until they started finding it off the coast of India or Madagascar. I feel like it was in Madagascar where they first discovered this, and this was in 1938. Um, Somebody found this in the fisherman's catch, and the fisherman was like, yeah, we're throwing these away. They taste awful and they're no good. And the person who saw this was like, oh my goodness, that's an extinct fish. That's not extinct. And they managed to, you know, get the interest of an ichthyologist, and they saved some parts, and then they were able to find specimens of it with the fishermen, and then obviously got pictures now, and it's pretty well established that it did not in fact go extinct 66 million years ago. And there's actually two extant species right now. There's the, I think, Western Indian Ocean coelacanth and the Indonesian coelacanth. So there's two species of it that are still around when it was thought that the entire group was gone. So it's pretty neat. But there's nothing spectacular about this deep water fish other than it was considered to be one of those links in the evolution between fish and terrestrial amphibians. Um, if you go back, and there's a gorilla that before it was recognized by Western scientists, most of the people in that area already knew there was these gorillas up on the mountain. I think that might even say that for the okapi, that was described initially from skins before it was viewed by, again, somebody from Western science, and that's somehow how these things go. And so and again, the fishermen knew about these fish for years before this researcher who recognized the importance of this catch saw it. And so you have these things where sometimes the people there know what's going on, and that's another piece that sometimes if you ever argue about this with cryptozoologists, they'll say, oh well, they know it's there. I mean, it's the legends. And this happens especially with things like Bigfoot or the Loch Ness monster, where they've been you can find legends that go back decades or centuries that hint about it before it became popular, and that can um embolden people to be like, it's been around, and it doesn't matter what we think, it's there. And that's not always the case. Um, Sometimes with cryptozoology, with finding these hidden animals, if you will, it's just a matter of wrong place wrong time. This is a kangaroo photographed in Waukesha, Wisconsin, and you can find. For whatever reason, kangaroos seem to be a really popular one that you can find out of place kangaroos in several different areas. And again, if you go with Occam's razor, there's no dimensional portal, there's no demonic kangaroo. Here's a kangaroo, and they photographed it in the brush. It probably escaped from a zoo, or somebody who was collecting it, or somebody that wasn't supposed to have it released it. Um, that easiest answer with the fewest assumptions is probably much more accurate. Even things like alligators in the sewers, which is this is a really obviously a little bit of a um, an image that's really kind of pushing that stereotype of this white subterranean alligator that's skin has lost all its pigment from being underground for so long, and it feeds on rats and all these things in the sewers, and it's just simply not the right place for alligators, and they can't survive. I think there's actually documented instances where alligators were found in a sewer, were found in different places where they should have been, but nine times out of, or 99 out of 100 or 999 out of 1,000 times, that's a animal that was caught and released. The pet trade um, in alligators for the longest time until they were protected and regulated was ridiculous. And then once they were protected and regulated, then the same people who are selling you these pet alligators as souvenirs in Florida started getting caimans, either legally or illegally, from um, South America and selling them as baby alligators, anyways. And how many people brought home a baby alligator, kept it for a little while, got bored with it, or got big and they didn't have anywhere to put it anymore because you can't keep it in your bathtub forever, and they released it and we're like, hope it's okay. When I worked in Cleveland, I worked in Cleveland from '98 to 2008, 2009. And I remember one summer there was an alligator sighted in a place just east of Cleveland called Mentor. It was Mentor Marsh. It's this really nice, big, place to go visit, natural place to go hiking and birding. And somebody had released an alligator in this marsh, and they had to tell people to stay away. And we got guys going out there in canoes trying to catch this alligator, and it's like the alligator. I think, and I remember you didn't hear of it again after that season, but the alligator wasn't going to survive the cold season in Cleveland, this poor thing. And it would have been great if somebody could have caught it and got it to a zoo or, um, rehab center, but it wasn't going to survive. And it's the same with these alligators in New York sewers. I don't know if any of you remember, but within, I think it was the last year, but maybe it might have been a couple years ago. Um, uh, this father-son duo shot and killed like a large gator here in Maryland, near the Chesapeake, out of safety for the kids. And I was like, you could have just let that alligator go and it probably would have been fine. But it's certainly not, it's very unlikely that the alligator was here naturally. Again, probably more likely, a better chance that one could be here naturally than someplace like Cleveland, Ohio. But a lot of times it's just, by anthropomorphic means, somebody moved it, is where these things happen. Um, uh, if I remember, I'll show you something else on the map a little bit later and talk about that, and these critters that get moved. And sometimes you have critters that are out of place. It's not unreasonable to find a European bird or three here every winter that get blown off course during migration. And that happens. But birds have wings, and it's obvious how they can move around and get around on their own. But alligators or kangaroos are something very different. And sometimes you can have something that's out of place that can become a legend. This is the Beast of Gevaudan, 1764 to 1767. In those years, it terrorized the province, quite literally. In this province of Gevaudan, it attacked livestock. Probably scared, um, quite a few ranchers and people. Um, it was eventually hunted and shot and killed, I believe. They had the fur on display for quite a while, the pelt, but I don't think it was ever properly scientifically analyzed before it was either destroyed or, the preservation techniques didn't work very well, so nobody got to test it. But one of the most popular theories about what this critter was, it's been listed, talked about as being a dog or a wolf or a dog wolf hybrid. But one of the other popular theories is that perhaps it was a striped hyena, because the description is very similar to something like this, including some of its behavior. And if you're someone who lives in a place where you've never seen anything that looks like that, And then seeing that eating your sheep or running by you or running at you is really going to cause you to take pause. Um, and so, I can imagine just taking a hike through my park and seeing something like that run across the path or get too close. It would make me, uh, for sure, step back because it's not something I normally see, and I would not recognize what that is. And so again, and this is well before, you've got a tons of printed books or anything with pictures, or we're way before the internet, things like that. And so having the knowledge in the general populace of these kind of things aren't going to be there. The number of critters that my daughter can tell you about from watching all these different TV shows about nature is just amazing. It's probably, beyond what I knew as a kid. And it's just the amount of knowledge that's out there and it could be shared and that, people talk about. But back then, hyena might not even know what a hyena was, let alone was from Africa. And who knows if it escaped from a circus or a zoo or some kind of thing like that. But here you have it now running the hillsides and eating all these critters, sheep and things like that. And it was definitely a problem because you don't want it eating your sheep, but you also don't want it coming after you. Um, so it always been one of my favorite stories. Is this the Beast of Gabadon? Um, and something I remember as a kid reading tons of snake books, and they always say, snakes can't grab their tail and spin, but this hoop snake, as it was called, was not only able to grab its tail and inflate itself and roll downhill and chase you, but it was also supposed to have a very venomous bite, um, and could really, really make you sick. And this is how it would catch its prey or go after critters that were bothering it. I just thought that was always fantastic. Never seen any picture even close to being purported to what a hoop snake is. And with all the knowledge that we have, there are still people that will sometimes claim that they've seen one of these, which is just interesting. One of the two possible, um, I hate to say culprit or suspect because it's not like these snakes did anything wrong, but one of the two possible origins for this story was, oh, wait, this is great. I found this on YouTube and I want to share. This is a really good example of exactly what people thought this snake could do, and I just like it's better than anything I could say. I thought this was great. Whoever put this little together.
No story is as bizarre or interesting as the myth of the hoop snake. This is a tale that even my great-grandmother told.
Darling, let me tell you about the deadly hoop snake. A true story, I swear. I was minding my own business, hoeing taters, when I was startled by this nasty critter. I had chopped the head off many a copperhead with my hoe, so I went in for the kill, but before I could reach him, he stung the handle. The venom of this snake is so deadly that my whole handle wilted. Then this nasty rascal did something I ain't never seen before. He grabbed his tail, formed a hoop, and rolled right after me, chasing me up to the door of the barn. Luckily, he didn't know how to open doors.
So what you have is you have a snake that's deadly, it's poisonous or venomous, if they want to use the right terms, but can also sting with its tail. Just these fantastic ideas. And again, there's this a general fear of snakes. And this is something that you saw more in the South, in the Southeast. And one of the snakes is thought this could be as the mud snake. And if you remember the detail from that story, there was a stinger in the tail. Well, if you look at mud snake's tail, their tails have almost like a spine or a point. They can use this to prod their prey to get it in their mouth correctly. If you grab a mud snake and hold it, that tail is going to pick and it's going to poke at you with that tail, not trying to sting you or paralyze you or inject any venom, but the snake's just trying to get away. And if that one more thing it can do is poke you, just like writhing and struggling when it's in your grip. And again, this mud snake, hopefully you can see this is its belly. It's bright red in the belly, which looks like it's some kind of warning coloration. It's actually non-venomous. And they're not very common in their range. They tend to live in aquatic environments, mostly aquatic. That's how they spend their life. And so there's not a lot known about them, but it is known that they cannot grab their tail by that little spine and then roll after you and then bite you because they're not venomous. They can't do that. And no snake can do that. One other snake that is thought to have inspired this story is the coach whip. Coach whips are really fast, which is probably how they got their name. And fast can often translate to aggression in people's minds when you've got something that a lot of people are scared of, like a coach whip. There's a really pretty snake. You see, they got a pretty big eye. They're very curious and they see very well. They'll often pop their head up and look around. Um, and there's a lot of different stories about the coach whip, and I wish I could get into them, but I don't think I have time. But it's worth a Google on if you go on Wikipedia and check out the coach whip. Some of the stories about what the snake can do are fascinating. But this is another snake that, like the milk snake, is thought to have fed on milk from cows and even from people. Like I said, that story is it's worth a Google. But it cannot roll in a circle. And I don't think it is, if I remember correctly, this is not a venomous snake either. It's not a constrictor, just grabs its prey and holds on to it before swallowing it. So both these snakes, which have these, might be the basis for the story. Neither one is venomous. Again, a lot of people think every snake is venomous, and it's just not true. So let's talk a little bit about water monsters here real quick. This is a photo of purporting to show Champ, which is the Lake Champlain monster. If you're not sure where Lake Champlain is, it's on the border between Vermont and New York. It's a really big lake. I think it's glacial. I think it's pretty deep. What's really interesting, I'm going to talk about the physics in a minute, but this is pretty classic for what you'll see with a lot of lake monster photos is what looks like a prehistoric dinosaur. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you can see this is supposed to the neck, and here's the head looking back. Here's a little hump on the back, and this is, really classic. It dates back to, the folklore surrounding another more famous lake monster, Nessie, the Loch Ness monster over in Scotland. I think a lot of people, when you read a lot about these lake monsters, there's a lot of people that want these lake monsters to be these plesiosaurs, that they're isolated, but they've been around since, excuse me, prehistoric times. The general problem with this is if you've only got one, or even if you've got a couple, you've got a genetic bottleneck where you've got a population that can't possibly exist because it's not big enough to avoid inbreeding, which is typically fatal. It's not helpful. It doesn't do the population any well. When you have a population gets below a certain number, it reaches that genetic bottleneck, and that's usually bad news for that population. So just that in general, but then being around as long as it has, just a lot of stories, and that's where you'll often find sometimes people delve into the supernatural and they start trying to explain shifting dimensions and time portals and other things that are simply you're unable to explain with science, and possibly that person also doesn't have a great grasp of what that really means in science. But this is typically what you'll see, and you'll even find this with sea serpents. This is probably the most famous Loch Ness monster photo. It's the one that's most often trotted out when everybody's talking about the Loch Ness. I think it's in the public domain. Certainly, it's fair use. And it's called the surgeon's photo. It was taken by a doctor. It could look impressive unless you look at the whole picture and you realize it's pretty small. But they always show this close up, and it looks like serpentine neck of a lake monster. I think it was a deathbed confession. There's a toy submarine underneath here, and this is a model of a neck. And what happened was this Duke went in search of the Loch Ness monster, came back claiming to have found footprints of the Loch Ness monster, which were later called a hoax, and were said to be made by hippopotamus foot trash can, which apparently was popular at the time, or and whether he faked them himself, I can't remember, or if somebody else faked it and duped him. Either way, he was really embarrassed, and he just, after this expedition to find the Loch Ness monster, he just kind of kept to himself. But he quietly enlisted this surgeon to fake a picture and put it out there to embarrass this newspaper that made fun of him for not finding the Loch Ness monster. So this is a hoax as well, unfortunately. Again, I'd love some of these creatures to exist. I just don't think they're out there. The baloney detector doesn't. It's hard to get past those things. And then you have an image like this, which really looks like, here's a plesiosaur's head and a neck, and you got some flippers over here. And this carcass was pulled up by a Japanese trawler, which is this name right here. I'm not even going to try. In I think the 70s. And it's most likely, if you show this to a shark expert or fish expert, they're most likely going to look at you and say, ah, that looks like a basking shark carcass. If you've ever looked at a basking shark, they have a big mouth that opens wide, and they feed like whale sharks or large whales. They eat krill. So they have this massive mouth. And again, they don't have a lot of bones because they're sharks, so it's all cartilage. And so when the shark dies, the first thing that deteriorates or disintegrates or is lost is that mouth. So this is actually the upper part of its head and maybe its nose, and right here would be where the mouth was, and that's already gone. So it gives this long-necked look to the carcass, but it's actually um, pretty much accepted to be a basking shark carcass. And again, sea serpents really popular. Just any body of water. Water is kind of a foreign place to us still. With as much as we can go, we can't breathe there, and we just don't see it like we see the land. This is a sea serpent that was spotted by the HMS Daedalus. Here's the first North American report of a sea serpent off the coast of Cape Ann in 1609, I think. And again, these are pretty common for what you see with sea serpent. With sea serpents, a long body or maybe even an undulating body. These coils, which I don't know anything that really swims like that. This was an interesting thing I stumbled across. This is called a sei whale, and it's thought that it's when it swims near the surface, you'll often see this protruding dorsal fin, and that this is what a lot of people often think was seen by the crew members of the HMS Daedalus. And again, if you've never seen something like that before, you may not know what you're seeing. Although it's interesting that obviously that's pointing backwards, so it would have been moving in this direction. But it does tremendously look like that illustration. And again, you've got this serpentine view, and I've seen some really neat um, illustrations and even a fantastic picture that shows how a couple of swimming seals or a couple of swimming otters could, swimming in sequence could look very similar to that, especially to the untrained eye or something to see there. You know, uh, welcome back to this day and age and technology, but when you see something for seconds and you're not ready for it and then it's gone, uh, even the mundane things can look pretty extraordinary when you only see it once and you can't spot it again. This is an oarfish. These can get pretty long. They can get to be 50 feet or so. Washed up on the coast of Bermuda in 1860s. This is a drawing of it. Obviously, we know what it is now. It was originally described as a sea serpent. But here's a more recent picture. This is one that washed up in San Diego in 1996. This is a SEAL team. So my guess is they were probably maybe working there or trading there at the time. But you can see there's no real shortage of lake monsters or bodies of water that don't have some mysterious critter in them. We got Scotland, Iceland, Canada, the U.S., Argentina, Colombia, Turkey, and I can off the top of my head probably name a half dozen more easily. Critters that aren't listed there. One that's not listed there is Chessie, the Chesapeake Bay monster. Nice close backyard one as well. And this one, Bessie in Lake Erie. This was always a really funny to me. Growing up in that region, I remember somebody brought in um, to the Cleveland Museum and Natural History what they thought was the Lake Erie monster. It turned out that they had, I think, stuffed a boa constrictor to try and look like that. It was really interesting. Attempted a fake or hoax, and they didn't even come close to fooling the museum staff on that one. Oh, and here's a map of monsters in North America. And you see there's a tremendous amount of aquatic critters there. Here we go. Here's Chessie here, number 10. Here's Champ, which I mentioned earlier. So all these different, aquatic critters, and then there's a lot of terrestrial ones here. We'll get to Bigfoot here in a little bit. I know I'm running out of time, so I don't want to take too long here. This is the one I want to mention, the Beast of Busco, Churubusco, Indiana. This giant snapping turtle. To me, it looks exactly like an alligator snapping turtle. Either someone got one from down south, dropped it in this lake, and now grew up and suddenly people are noticing this massive, bigger than normal snapping turtle, or somebody found a big one and also dumped it in there. But either way, it's entirely possible. And you can see this number 4. That's actually pretty north in Indiana. It's outside of the normal range of those turtles, which is further down here in Kentucky, Tennessee. Actually, I don't know how much they go up in Tennessee even. Um, so it's not unlikely that one could have wandered that far, but it's much more likely that somebody dropped that in the lake. Again, just using those keys in the baloney detector. So let's come back to Champ for a minute. That Lake Champlain, is known to have some massive waves, some seiches, seiche, Seiche. And what happens is you can have wind blowing pretty steadily across the upper level, the surface of water, and it can actually push it. And you could do this, you can pull out a bowl, put a little water in it, and then blow parallel to that water, and you'll see that you can push waves and it'll push it up higher than it would normally sit in the pond. But at some point, that wind's going to end, and this water is going to slosh back into place, and that can cause waves. Not like tidal waves, but some of them can be pretty significant depending on the wind motion. Here's an image of the before and after of a site there. You can see that's a lot of water sloshing over there, sloshing over the walls there on this lake. Um, one of the thoughts, I think, yeah, one of the thoughts is that um, where these two layers of water meet underneath the surface in Lake Champlain can be pretty turbulent because water at different temperatures has different densities. And so there tends to be a quick gradient, but those two layers don't normally mix. And if you had a log move across this layer and end up in this turbulence, this underwater site, which could be 30 to 300 feet. It's amazing how big these waves could be. It could, if you have a large stick or even a tree trunk caught in that, it could kick that up out of the water and produce that image that you see in Sandra Mansey's photo, which is that famous Champ photo I started this section off with. I highly recommend it. If anybody's interested, you can email me afterwards. I highly recommend. There's an article in Discover Magazine where they talk about the physics of what's going on underneath the surface in Lake Champlain and how that could have contributed to an image like that, and maybe even in other lakes as well. I thought that was really fascinating. And it's not that many assumptions because this is something we know happens. I want to shift gears for a minute and start with a critter we know, like the barn owl. And you got the barn owl, but you also have different stories. You can have different critters that come from sightings or hearings of this critter. If you've never heard of barn owl, or barn owl, excuse me, Barn, I'm not gonna watch the whole video, but I want you to just hear what this barn owl sounds like. That is a serious noise.
He's just saying hello loudly.
Yeah.
Yes.
That is what
One
a barn
more.
owl sounds like.
Now imagine being out in the dark and hearing that. That would be a really chilling sound. I don't do well in the dark all the time, and that I know would give me pause. Just in general of what's out here with me, or do I even want to go any further in the dark? Um, there's a rich history of banshees in Ireland and parts of Scotland, and it's thought that the keening or the grieving sound that these ghosts would make at the loss of a family member, or at the soon to come loss of a family member, is actually has its origin in the barn owl's screech. That's where that came from. The Flatwoods Monster, which is this fantastic story from Flatwoods, West Virginia, is sometimes attributed to a sighting of a barn owl. There was a streaking light, and there was red pulsing, flashing lights. Well, there's airline beacons nearby, and there was a meteor that was documented and seen in West Virginia and Ohio and I think Indiana at the time of this sighting. This creature came out of the woods and it had these red glowing eyes. Well, at night, there's a lot of critters with red glowing eyes. If you look on the left there, that is not a Flatwoods Monster. It's not a Chupacabra. It's not even a Sasquatch. It is a barred owl. But that red glowing eyes can really catch people off guard because I think a lot of people forget how these eyes will glow in dark conditions. And the Jersey Devil, if you've never heard of it, is a fantastic story. I recommend it sometimes. Its whole origin seems to come out of some really supernatural stories, but this was supposed to have haunted the Pine Barrens of New Jersey and even Delaware and Maryland. There was when the first scare came out, was it 1909? Remember the exact date, but the initial scare, they closed schools. Workers refused to show up for work. People were really scared of this thing. There was vigilante groups that went out looking for the Jersey Devil. Hoof prints found in snow, or they were footprints that melted after this big snow followed by a melting period. They were distorted and they weren't really hoof prints at all. A lot of really interesting stories. It's even thought, some people attribute the Jersey Devil to a barn owl. There are other naturalists who have suggested that it could have been a sandhill crane, but certainly unlikely that it was the cursed 13th baby of a angry and evil old woman. Just lots of really interesting stories abound there. Um, uh, and on a side note, as a bonus owl story, if you ever had a chance to look up the Kelly Hopkinsville goblins, which supposedly terrorized a family for 4 hours before the 5 adults and 7 children managed to all hop into their cars and drive to the local police station. um, After researching this and discovering the level of intoxication of some members of this party, it suggested that mating great horned owls were what actually scared this family, which is just really interesting. It's certainly worth a read. I wish I could get into more of these. But this story, when this family came in, the local police were worried that there was actually another family involved and that this might have turned into some kind of feud. They dispatched 4 city police, 5 state troopers, 3 deputy sheriffs, and 4 military police from the nearby fort. Um, and when they got there, the only thing they found were gunshots in the windows and the doors and in a few other trees nearby, but they didn't find any 2 foot yellow-eyed goblins. And then, of course, the other half of cryptozoological royalty, besides the Loch Ness Monster, is Bigfoot. And this is frame 352, I believe, from the Gimlin Patterson film, which is the famous film they often show. That's purported to show uh, a female Bigfoot. I think is widely accepted as a hoax now and understood to be a hoax, whether the filmers were in on it or not. Um, it's a hoax. The whole Bigfoot phenomenon really hit North America pretty big in about 1958. The gentleman here on the left in the black and white photo, his name is Jerry Crew. He'd come to work one day in Bluff Creek and found all these giant footprints. He's got a plaster cast of one there he's holding around his bulldozer and throughout his construction site. And it made news, it made national news, and this is, I think, really the beginning of the modern day Bigfoot craze in North America. The gentleman on the right here is Ray Wallace, whose family, after he passed, has said pretty convincingly that he, as a prankster, was somebody who went out and made all those footprints around Jerry Crew's bulldozer and construction site as a gag because he knew those guys as well. Ray Wallace is an interesting character that needs to be investigated, but you can look around North America and find tons of stories. Momo is the Missouri monster. The skunk ape is in Florida. The Yowie is Australia. The Yeti is obviously the Himalayas. Almas is, I think that's Russia, but maybe it's South America. I'm getting myself backwards. Bigfoot's the Pacific Northwest. The Folk monster is in Texas. The Grassman is Ohio. If you look at, do I have that? Yeah, here. If you look at percentage of forest cover by state, I can go with Oregon, Washington, or even Northern California. Idaho, where you get 30 to 40% of forest cover. But Ohio, which doesn't even have 30%, and a lot of that is secondary growth or reclaimed farmland, just doesn't make sense to me. I've always thought that, I've always felt like it'd be really cool to see that. I think at one time it was even listed on the endangered species list in either Oregon or Washington. I think it's listed as protected in New York right now. You can see some interesting numbers of forest cover here, and those are big numbers, but there's a lot of development around that as well. Just don't have the patches of forest that you would need for something that large to survive. I'm going to skip ahead to my last slide here and let you guys go because I tell them right on it. If you want to read more, this is a huge subject, and it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of interesting if you really get into some of the researchers, the people that actually go out on these sites and look for this. They're not just cutting and pasting and making their own book, but people like Robert Michael Pyle, this gentleman here in the middle book. This is a really rational thought process into, could something like this survive, and what would it have to do to really live. This is a really good book. Robert Michael Pyle is a really good author. On the left, I think these Daniel Loxton and Donald Prothero are from I think it's Skeptic magazine. This is a really good book. I really enjoyed it. The origins of these stories. They definitely come out from a rational and skeptical eye. It was a really good read, especially the stuff about sea monsters. I mentioned Bernard Hoovelmans earlier, and he had made a whole classification of sea serpents. It's just really odd because you look at it and think, well, isn't that a turtle? Isn't that this? Isn't that that? Or the evolution of sea serpents, because they used to be described often as horse-faced, or having the head of a horse, and these are the much older descriptions. Whereas modern day, everybody seems to see something that's a reptile or a reptilian or a plesiosaur, and it speaks, I think, often to the expectations that if you see something like that, what you think it would be versus what you're actually seeing. Um, as always, I appreciate you joining me in your evening after work or whatever else you've done during the day that you've chosen to spend 60 minutes or more with me discussing things. And again, I'm happy to um, share some other thoughts or ideas for or other sources you could read. This is uh, even though I'm not the staunch believer I once used to be, I'm definitely a big fan of these stories and these ideas and um, what it says about the human psyche and what it says about our need to still want to be able to find things that are new, maybe scary, but certainly um, not something that we know about. That we still want some kind of frontier. We still want new things to be able to be found out there. Um, so thank you for joining me. It's 8 o'clock. If you have any questions, please feel free to unmute and ask me. But I hope it was enjoyable for you and worth your time to hang out with me tonight. Slightly different topic from what I usually do. Anybody? Does somebody want to unmute and just say hi so I know that you're all still there?
Great job, Ken. It was
Okay, thanks.
a
I just
fascinating
did that.
presentation.
I just want to know if somebody was still there. I just see a bunch of initials, so thanks, Christine. Oh, well, if nobody has any questions, you all have a good night. I will get going. And next month I'm doing urban birds. Talk a lot about, pigeons and uh, starlings, crows, yeah, robins, sparrows, the birds that I think most people overlook because you see them so often, but they've got some really neat adaptations and stories as well. And we'll come back to Earth, talk about something a little more natural next time. Thanks, Janine. I don't know the date off the top of my head. It's in the new Enjoy. Um, sorry, I don't remember the date. Actually, you know what? I can find that real quick because I know it's a Wednesday. And I know it's in November. I'm betting it's the second one. It is November 10th. Deep dive on urban birds. No problem. All right. Well, I am going to end the recording. You all have a great night. I am going to go, I think, put my daughter to bed. Take care and thanks.